There have been fewer camera releases met with as much excitement as the Sony a7S III. Now that the camera's been out for nearly 2 years and I've had mine for 1 year, let's see if the hype around this Sony is real or phony. People who are already Sony fans waited 5 years for this camera's release, from the a7S II to the a7S III. I heard all the hype, and honestly I didn't really buy into it. I thought it was just hype. That is, until I got my a7S III. But before that, no, this video is not sponsored. I paid for all my Sony cameras at full price with my own money. And once again, if you still don't believe me, I'll be wearing my awesome Canon shirt for the rest of this video, and I'll also freely say that Canon cameras are awesome. So this video is going to cover everything about the a7S III from my point of view, and at the end I'm also going to talk about how it compares to the FX3 and how it stacks up against the newer and more affordable a7 IV. So you're in for a treat. Now, just so I can hold and show you the a7S III in this video, I am using the FX3 as my main camera, but as you probably know, the internals of both of these cameras are identical. So the image quality that you're getting out of the FX3 right here is exactly the same as you would be seeing if the a7S III were on the tripod instead. So after hearing about how great the a7S III was, when I got mine, I was expecting to be completely blown away with it. And I did like it a lot right away, but honestly, I was not blown away by it right away. Maybe it was just because I was switching camera systems, but it really took about 4 to 6 months before I started feeling like I was using this camera to its full capability, and where I was starting to consistently get results that I don't think I could have gotten on any other camera system before this. And when I got the a7S III, even though I had been firmly in the Canon camp and I loved my EOS R, when I was looking for a new camera, there were a few things that I was looking for, and I was trying to be as objective as possible. I was looking for full frame 4K, no overheating, great IBIS, great autofocus, and no record limit. And when I took all of those things and just sort of looked at every manufacturer that was available at the time, every model that was available at the time, at least within my budget, the a7S III was the only one that checked all of those boxes for me. And so as much as I had originally planned to stick with Canon, it kind of just made sense to give the Sony a try, and I'm Sony glad that I did. Boy. Now, even though I've been using Canon cameras for years, at my previous job I did use some Sony bodies. We were mostly Canon equipped, but I did use the Sony a7S II and the Sony a7 III pretty regularly, and I honestly just didn't really like those cameras. Something about them just didn't click with me at all, and I just wasn't getting good results with them. I didn't like the ergonomics, I didn't like the way that they feel, and even though the a7S III is physically very similar to the cameras that came before it, it's also just different enough that for some reason it did click with me in a good way. I think it's pretty well known at this point that Canon is great with ergonomics on their cameras. When you pick up a Canon camera, it just feels really good, the layout's really nice on it, and the a7S III to me is equally as good. Like, it feels really great to use. The buttons are in logical places that are easy to access. It works great. Of course, they added the flip out screen finally. This is a very well-built camera. I had this thing in my mind previously that Sony cameras were a little bit more delicate and a little bit more fragile. I don't know if that has been the case in the past, but this one is every bit as durable as any higher end Canon body that I've used, which are very, very rugged and very durable as well. The button layout is amazing. The fact that you can customize everything is amazing. It's a really well-built, well-designed camera. So not only do you have all these buttons and dials and joystick and everything, but you can pretty much remap everything to be whatever you want it to be. So whatever you're used to, even coming from Canon, I was able to kind of change some things around so that buttons were in positions that I was used to them being in, and you can just customize the whole camera. So you got this really well-built camera, it's really well designed, and then you can fine-tune it to suit your needs. And of course, part of suiting your needs means having lots of I/O ports, which is a very important feature, and this camera has no shortage of ports. So on the side over here, you've got headphones and microphone, and the microphone door is its own door so that when it's open and plugged in, you can rotate the screen. I should probably close the other doors. You can rotate the screen without it hitting the microphone input. And then you've got the headphone input, and you've got the USB-C input, and the micro multifunction USB input as well. And right here, you've got, maybe most importantly of all the ports, full-size HDMI, which in my eyes is something that any video-centric camera should have. In my FX3 review, a lot of people ask me why I dislike micro HDMI so much, and the reason is not that it produces lower quality or anything, it's just a much less reliable port. And if you're on a video-centric camera. We're gonna be plugging things in and out constantly. It's so easy for that very delicate small port to just get bent or moved a little bit, and then it stops working reliably. Full-size HDMI is not invincible, but it's a lot more durable than micro HDMI, and if you're using a video-centric camera, it only makes sense that you would have a video-centric output. And another benefit of the design is that, as you might have noticed, these aren't flaps over the ports, these are little doors that open and close, and it is possible to remove them. There are YouTube videos out there on how to do that, but I like that they're just doors that open or close. I was flabbergasted by how much better they are than flaps. A lot of other cameras just sort of use these rubbery flaps, and then over time, they don't necessarily like clip in as well anymore. They kind of get in the way. The doors that just open or close is way more convenient if you're constantly plugging stuff into your camera. And yes, since this does have the flip out screen, if you do have multiple things connected at once, it is more difficult to turn the screen without hitting them, and the screen will be blocked by some of your peripherals. There's no way around that when it comes to having a flip out screen and having lots of I/O ports. It just kind of is what it is. When we're talking about cameras, build quality, design, all that stuff is very important, but arguably the most important feature is the image quality. And as you hopefully know at this point, the image quality from the a7S III is just absolutely stunning. Sony colors are definitely different than Canon colors or other companies' colors if you're coming from a different system, but they're very easy to work with. I have found them to be very neutral and accurate. They've definitely come a long way from previous Sony models, so the current generation of Sony cameras is very different than something you might have used in the past. And of course, you have all kinds of great options like S-Log and S-Cinetone to kind of help you have a lot of flexibility with your colors. But honestly, for most of the stuff I do, pretty much all my YouTube videos, I just use the default picture profile, and I think the colors look great. I might push them a little bit in Final Cut Pro, but nothing too crazy. I think the colors straight out of the camera look straight up awesome. And an unexpected perk to that image quality is actually the file size on the camera. So you have a whole bunch of different options. Typically I record in the XAVC-S mode, but the XAVC-SI mode is the highest quality. And if there's not a ton of moving stuff in the frame, like right now, XAVC-S is fine. I think for most video work, it's totally fine. If you're doing something that's like a lot of sports, or you're out in like a forest where there's trees and leaves and branches and stuff moving everywhere, that's where you'd want to use the SI, which is going to create larger files. But something that's very cool is the 4K XAVC-S files from the a7S III are smaller than the 1080 files out of the EOS R. Typically for a video like this, my talking head portion will be about 40 minutes of raw footage, and that usually comes out to about 21 gigabytes. On the EOS R, that would have been upwards of 30 gigabytes. And if I did 4K on the EOS R, it would have been like 70 or 80 gigabytes, where even if I do XAVC-SI, the higher quality mode, it comes out to about 50-ish gigabytes for that same amount of footage. So I did not expect that the full frame 4K would produce smaller file sizes than what I was used to on my EOS R. And that was a huge perk since the memory cards are more expensive and it's not as easy to use like 256 gigabyte cards. It's not as affordable to use 256 gigabyte cards on this camera. And as I mentioned in my FX3 review, the ability to record 120 FPS at 4K 120, is absolutely an amazing feature on this camera. I didn't care about it when I bought the camera. I knew people had been talking about it, but once I had it, it became a really integral part of my workflow, as I've explained previously, not just for making stuff look cool, but for product B-roll, being able to have 4K 120 and then stabilizing that even more in Final Cut Pro really means that I don't need to use my tripod, slider, and gimbal nearly as much as I used to when I was just using the EOS R. It's still great to use those tools sometimes, but the ability to just do so much work totally handheld, it just makes things so much easier and makes the workflow so much better. And even though I'm not using CF Express Type A cards, there are of course 2 memory card slots. Each slot can be SD or CF Express Type A, which is very, very impressive. I've been using these V90 cards, 128 gigabyte cards. I have a SanDisk card here. I have a ProGrade card in the FX3, and they've been working great. They can do just about every frame rate except for like 4K 120 at the highest bitrate setting. So I don't really feel limited by using regular SD cards as long as they're V90 cards. It's hot in here, I'm starting to sweat. But you know what? Even though I'm overheating, you know what will never overheat? The Sony a7S III. I'm sure that it's possible to make the camera overheat somehow, but I have not had it come close to overheating even once in the year that I've had it. And as you might know, I live in the desert where it gets very, very hot. Last year we had over 100 days in a row where temperatures reached over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 37 degrees Celsius. And we also had like a month's worth of days where temperatures were over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, which is like 48 degrees Celsius. So if there's any situation that's going to overheat a camera, I figure it's that. Now, of course, if you want to be sure that your camera will never overheat, that's where the FX3 comes into play because it does have a fan, which is going to prevent that no matter what. But overheating on the A7S III just hasn't been an issue for me. Now, sometimes when I'm using the camera, it will get warm, but I just figure that's because all of the footage I film is fire, as the kids say. All these frame rates, all these features are going to take a toll on battery life, and fortunately Sony has gotten a lot better when it comes to battery life. It's very hard to give a definitive benchmark of what battery life is going to be because there are so many variables, but I can say that with heavy use, if I'm recording constantly and I'm using 4K 120 and I'm using active image stabilization and all of these crazy things, I can confidently get over 2 hours of battery life, which is pretty good when I'm putting the camera through that kind of a ringer. If you're going out with the camera for a while, just bring an extra battery and you won't have anything to worry about. And of course, those ports that I mentioned earlier, it's so easy to run the camera off of USB-C. That's what both of these cameras are being run off of right now. You need to have a battery pack inserted in the camera, and then you just connect it to a USB-C charger or plug. A quick note though with USB-C power is that depending on what you have it connected to, if it doesn't have enough power, you might still notice your battery life decreasing. It's just going to decrease a lot more slowly than it would if it weren't plugged in. If you want to make sure you're never, ever, ever going to run out of power, just get a dummy battery pack for the camera, and then you know it's always going to have power as long as it's plugged in. Now we should focus on the camera's autofocus because, as I mentioned, that was one of the huge reasons that I wanted to get the Sony system in the first place, is because I was so impressed with all of the autofocus examples that I was seeing in other people's reviews. And yes, the focus is absolutely amazing for both photo and video. It will just lock right onto your eye and stay there. You can adjust the sensitivity and like the stickiness of the focus, the speed, I guess, of the focus. Depending on how you want it set, it might switch between subjects really quickly, or it will just find a subject and stick with it. And of course you can just touch the screen, tap to focus, and then it will just stick to that subject. You do have the really cool option where if the subject leaves the frame, the camera won't focus on anything else until that subject comes back into the frame, and then it will pick up right there. That's pretty awesome. In general, I keep my autofocus sensitivity setting set to 3, and that seems to be pretty usable, but also fairly natural. If I hold this up, you'll see it's gonna focus there. And then if I take that back, it's going to focus back on me, but it's not going to be super quick and super artificial looking. It almost looks like there's a person over there manually focusing the lens. Here is my definitive IBIS test. Right now I have nothing turned on. This is just no stabilization, and I'm walking and I'm kind of running. And I'm using a 24mm lens. Now this is standard stabilization. There still shouldn't be a crop. This is me walking. This is me running. There we go. And now, this is now active stabilization, so you should notice a bit of a crop. This is me walking, and this is me running. So again, active walking, active running, standard walking, standard running, and no stabilization walking, no stabilization running. It's no surprise that as a Sony camera, this is an absolute low light monster. I've never had a camera that performs as well in low light as the A7S III and of course the FX3. So here are some examples of the camera's capabilities in low light. We could call these delightful because low light meant that I was delighting the scene. To make it less light, So now I'm outside with the only light being from these market lights in our backyard. This is the exact same settings that I used in the studio with this camera. So this is the 24mm lens at f1.4 with ISO 100. And I will just keep increasing the ISO. This is ISO 320. You can start to see more outline of the little plant over here. This is ISO 640, ISO 1000, 1250. Here's 1600. 2000, 2500, 3200, 4000, 5000, 6400, 8000, ISO 10000, 12800, ISO 16000, 20000, 25600, 32000, 64,000, 80,000, all the way up to 409,000, which is unusable and ridiculous. So this is ISO 32,000 with autofocus, tracking dogs in what is otherwise a pitch black environment. If I take it down to ISO 5,000, this is pretty much what it looks like in real life. And if I go back down to where things were in the studio, that's ISO 100. Now, part of the reason that the camera is so good in low light is because of this amazing 12 megapixel sensor. Now, you do have photo capabilities on this camera, and you are limited to 12 megapixels for your photo capabilities. The still image quality is fantastic. The autofocus works great. It's everything you would expect from a great photo camera, except you don't have the highest resolution sensor. And that's because this is not a photo first camera. This is a video first camera, and 12 megapixels is great for video because that's what helps the camera to have better image quality, better low light performance, no rolling shutter, and no overheating even at higher frame rates. It's all due in part to that smaller, lower resolution sensor, which is perfect for 4K video. But even though you've only got 12 megapixels for stills, it's not super limiting. If you're planning not to blow anything up beyond like 20 by 30 inches or thereabouts, it's still going to look great. And if you're not planning on cropping in and doing some really intense like compositing or something, it's also going to work very well. If you need a higher resolution camera, that's where something like the a7 IV might come into play with its 33 megapixel sensor, or if you want a photo first camera, that's where like the a7R series might come into play, or even something like the A1. Now, even though this Sony is so neat, that doesn't mean it's perfect. There are a few things I don't like about the camera. None of them are deal breakers, but they're definitely things you should be aware of if you're still thinking of purchasing the camera. First is, as I've mentioned as often as I can in other videos, the screen. It's not great. Especially on a $3,400 camera, I would expect a better display. You might have seen my FX3 review where I talked about the EOS R's display, which is not only bigger, but it's also higher resolution and more color accurate, and it's just a better display. And this camera cost half the price and came out years before this camera did. So this lower end, older camera has an infinitely better screen than this newer, more expensive, higher end camera does. And that goes for all of these. It's basically the same screen on the FX3, on the a7 IV. I just feel like Sony has a surplus of like 1 billion 3-inch LCD screens that aren't great, but they're just gonna keep putting them in every camera until they run out of screens. And this may or may not be fair, but something I don't like right now is that I've been waiting for months now for features to trickle up via firmware updates from the a7 IV into the a7S III. And that includes things like the focus breathing compensation, which I think would be possible even on a 12 megapixel sensor, the ability to turn on the shutter as a sensor cover, and something I would really love, this dial right here, this exposure compensation dial, is so nice. Listen to how clicky and perfect it is. But if you use your camera in any kind of manual mode, this button or this dial is entirely useless. It does absolutely nothing and you can't reassign it to anything. On the a7 IV, you can reassign that dial to whatever you want. So I have mine set to do audio. I can just dial this in to raise and lower my audio level, and if I have it exactly where I want, I can lock it so it can't be changed. It's awesome. Can't do that on here. I just have this useless dial that's not been used for anything. Very much waiting for that feature to show up in a future firmware update, hopefully. Those are small details, and I understand sometimes why camera companies won't take features from higher end cameras and put them in lower end cameras, but in this case, I don't know why Sony is waiting so long to bring features from lower end cameras into higher end cameras that are still the current models. And that's really my other dislike of the camera, is kind of the lack of firmware updates. Canon has really been kicking butt lately. When it comes to firmware, it seems like every few months something pretty major comes out for some of their cameras that brings in a lot of new functionality and a lot of new flexibility. Maybe this camera was just so good from the beginning, it didn't need that many updates. But at this point, there's definitely things that could be added to it. And the last complaint I have is when there are firmware updates, how you have to do them on a Sony camera. It sucks. It's the worst system ever. You have to install all these little apps and things. You have to like go into the security settings on your like computer's root system. Even on the a7 IV, which has had a firmware update recently, it took me like hours and 2 computers to figure it out. And I'm not that dumb. Like, I understand how to do firmware. It's just things weren't working reliably. It's so clunky and so involved and so unnecessary. Do you know how you update the firmware on a Canon camera? You just put the memory card in your computer, put the firmware file on it, put it in your camera, and then tap update firmware, and you're done. That's how it should be on every camera. And I don't know why Sony has this absolutely insane firmware update system. Now, one big question when it comes to the a7S III or any camera is how compatible will the files be with your computer? And there are a lot of variables to that question. What I can say is when this camera first came out, you saw a lot of people saying that their computers were really struggling to edit the files. Now it seems like a lot of software applications have been updated to work better and be more optimized for these files. But also computers have gotten better too since the camera's release. I've been editing files with no issues on both my base model M1 Mac Mini, the cheapest computer that Apple sells, and my 14-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro, which is a much higher end computer. They both edit the files just fine. If I need to work on a project with lots of layers of footage from these cameras, that's where the M1 Max really comes in handy, and it's a super smooth experience. I don't know what the PC equivalent of that would be, but one thing that I definitely recommend if you're thinking of getting a new camera, especially a higher end, more expensive camera like this, is to rent it first. I'm not connected with them in any way, but I've used lensrentals.com a lot, so I like them and I do recommend them. It's pretty affordable to just rent this camera for a week and then see how it feels, see how it works with your workflow, see how your hardware handles the files from it, and then you'll have a much better idea of exactly how this camera or any camera will fit into your specific workflow. Now at this point, I think it's pretty much impossible to talk about the a7S III without also talking about the FX3, since they're basically share the exact same DNA. I do have an entire full review on the Sony FX3. I definitely recommend checking that out if you're interested in that camera. But if you're wondering just quickly how these two cameras compare or where the strengths and weaknesses of each are, a couple things that are better about the FX3 for me would be the top handle being one of them. You can add top handles to the accessory shoe. You can put a cage on the a7S III. But the FX3 just straight out of the box comes with a top handle that bolts into the body and has the XLR inputs built right into it. You can get an XLR module for the a7S III, which is basically the exact same quality and features as the FX3, but it doesn't have the handle component, and I really love how sturdy the FX3 feels with that handle. And because of that, the FX3 is $400 or $500 more expensive than the a7S III, but I do think it's because of the XLR top handle, and if you get the a7S III setup with an XLR interface and you have the FX3 setup with its XLR interface, they're gonna then basically be the exact same price. So if XLR functionality is really important to you and you like the idea of just a super secure, easy to use top handle, I think the FX3 is definitely a winner there. The FX3 also has one of my absolute favorite features, which are 3 tally lights. Whether it's the top, the back, or the front of the camera, you can always look directly at the FX3 and know that it's recording. As is the case with most Sony cameras, when you record with the a7S III, you can set it to emphasize recording on the display and you'll get this red border around the screen, and that is hugely helpful, but having actual physical lights is delightful. It's an enlightening experience. And I wish this had at least one little tally light on the front to let you know when it's recording. And a very big difference about the FX3 is of course the ergonomics, because that's the biggest difference between these cameras is the physical design of them. I can't say if it's better or worse, it depends entirely on your preference, but they are very, very different. And if you were to hold both in one hand, you might have a strong preference towards one over the other. And as I said earlier, the FX3 does have a built-in fan, of which I am a fan. It does kind of ding down the weather sealing a little bit because since you have a vent with fans, it can't be quite as weather sealed as a camera like this without it, but it also makes sure you're never gonna deal with overheating in any circumstances. Now there are also a few things that are better about the a7S III than the FX3. The biggest difference is going to be this EVF right here, which is a really nice viewfinder, and the FX3 does not have an EVF or even the option to add one on. Like on the Blackmagic 6K Pro, you can add on an EVF if you want one. Nothing like that for the FX3, you're just stuck with the screen on the back, which isn't the highest quality screen in the world. This has a really nice EVF, although super strange, you can adjust the white balance of the EVF, but you can't adjust the white balance of the display. And that's weird and annoying because if you could adjust the white balance of the display, it would then be a lot more accurate, and I don't know why you can do one and not the other. It's frustrating. And one thing that I really love a lot more about the a7S III is the physical mode dial. I really dislike the way that you switch modes on the FX3. You have to press the mode button and then go through the on-screen menu to go to your different modes. The a7S III uses the tried and true method of just having a physical dial that you can switch between all your different photo and video modes, and that's it. And it's quick and it's easy and you can see it right away. It's just the simplest and best solution. That's just how it should be. And finally, it's really not fair to talk about the a7S III without also talking about the a7 IV, which is almost identical in physical design. There are a few minor changes, but it pretty much looks like the exact same camera, it's just $1,000 cheaper. So why wouldn't you just get the a7 IV over the a7S III? There are a few very specific benefits to the a7S III. The build quality is actually a little bit better on the a7S III, even though they look the same, and I'll talk about that more on my a7 IV review. But the biggest strength is that 12 megapixel sensor, because that's what gives you no rolling shutter, no overheating, no crop in any of the modes. So there's a crop on 4K 60 on the a7 IV, and there is no 4K 120. So if you need 4K 120, this is definitely the way to go. And the a7 IV, while overheating isn't really a huge issue, and I've never had a problem with it, it is something that you need to potentially be aware of with the a7 IV, depending on which modes you shoot in more. Some are more prone to causing heat than others. And one small detail that the a7S III has is this little IR sensor right here. The a7S III has it, the FX3 has it, and the a7 IV does not have it. And what that lets you do is grab something like this $20 Sony remote, and now you can just control your cameras remotely. You can start, stop recording, you can zoom in, you can even go through menus and playback images. The a7 IV got rid of this really cool, really simple feature, but the a7S III still has it. So when it comes to the a7S III, what I'd like to emphasize is that from the time I got my very first DSLR in 2007, I pretty much only used Canon cameras, both personally and professionally. I absolutely loved Canon cameras. But the a7S III clicked with me in a way that no other Sony camera had, and once I really started to understand it, it opened up kind of an entirely new world of video creativity and possibilities. There was definitely a lot of hype and a lot of rave reviews when this camera was first released, but after using it and owning it for a year, I can say that it definitely lives up to the hype. And speaking of things that live up to the hype, thank you to everyone who helped support my channel through Patreon and YouTube channel memberships. And even though the Sony a7S III and FX3 are very similar, they also have enough differences to shine in their own ways. Check out my full review of the FX3 to see why it's unexpectedly become one of my most trusted tools.